So let's define what the Surface Plane is. Like all the other planes, it has a software/task side, and it also has an information side. Except in this case, visual design spans both of those areas. On the software and task side, visual design is what determines whether something is obvious, is intuitive, and quite frankly, whether it's used. When you look at a screen and you see components and you see controls and you see content, the visual appearance of those things gives you a clue as to what you can possibly do with those things, how you can manipulate them, how you can interact with them. On the information side of the fence, what visual design does is essentially it makes things easier to understand, right? It increases your cognitive ability to absorb what you see on the screen. It minimizes the effort required to read and comprehend what you see. So in essence, what we're essentially doing on the Surface Plane is creating what's called visible language. Visible language refers to all the graphical techniques that we use to indicate context and convey information. And those techniques include layout, formats, proportions, grids, organization, all the underlying structure that determines what elements live where on the screen. We have typography, which is font selection and styling. What fonts do we use and how are we going to style them? Are they bold? Are they italic? Are they large? Are they small? Etc., etc. We have color, which is all about influencing perception and emotion. The Surface Plane is also where we start thinking about imagery, signs, icons, symbols, things that communicate or signal use. Imagery also, of course, includes things like photography or illustrations, anything that's going to reinforce and support the context of use and enhance the understanding of the topic or subject at hand. The Surface Plane is also where we utilize sequencing. Okay, this is an overall approach to visual storytelling. In a lot of cases, what's happening, not only on a single screen, but from screen to screen to screen, is there's a story that's unfolding. There's a narrative that's happening, much like a movie, okay? Almost anything that's interactive has very film-like quantities to it. So the idea of proper pacing, proper sequencing, applies just as much here as it does to a moving picture. Finally, we're addressing issues of visual identity. How does the organization or the product line express itself in this visible language? Okay, what does the brand say to us? Is it conservative and refined? Is it cutting edge and forward thinking? Is it wild and innovative? All the visual decisions, the graphic decisions that we make communicate those kinds of things. So we want to be very judicious about what we use and why we're using it. We want the fonts and colors and imagery that we use to be appropriate. Let's start with some principles of good user interface design. There are three fundamental principles that are at the core of creating a visual interface design that's effective. First, we have to organize. We're providing the user with a clear, consistent conceptual structure of how this thing works. Second, we have to economize, which means we want to do the most that we can with the least amount of cues. Do more with less. Keep things simple. Third, and maybe most importantly, we have to communicate. We have to match the presentation that people see on the screen to the expectations and capabilities of the user. Both of those things are extremely important. When someone comes to an application or someone comes to a website, they already know what they want from it. They come in with a preconceived idea of what's going to happen, how it's going to unfold, and what the value is they're going to get out of it. The visual design has to communicate that to some degree, or at least has to reveal the fact that those things exist. The capabilities of the user are also equally important. Design should do everything it can to enhance understanding, to make things obvious. You create cues, visual cues, that allow people to get in, start doing stuff, and sort of automatically start understanding how the system works, how I move around, how I do things, how I interact with information. Those three principles are at the core of good UI design, and we're going to expand on each one. The first thing good user interface design does is organize, and that means creating a clear visual hierarchy. Doing that enables consistency, clearly signifies relationships between elements on the screen and improves navigation. Visual hierarchy allows us to determine what's most important among all the stuff that we're seeing, right? This thing is what I want to do first. This thing is probably what I want to do next after I'm done. There's an order of importance that has to get established that should ideally match the same order of importance that the user has when they come into the situation. Here's a quick example of how visual hierarchy works. If you look at a screen that's organized like this, where we have lots of different elements, lots of different sizes, things that sort of overlap and intersect, while it might be artistically interesting, it's a recipe for disaster for someone who's trying to accomplish a task on a phone or a tablet or a laptop. A much better approach is something that's a little more ordered and a little more structured that looks like this. When we look at a screen where all the elements have a strong visual relationship to one another, it's very easy to, at a glance, get a sense of how much of it there is, get a sense of which elements are related to each other, and get a relatively quick understanding of each type of content. The brain's essential job is to comprehend things, understand things, and try to make connections between things. So when we see multiple items on a screen, we're automatically trying to figure out how they belong together, how they relate to each other, how they interact to some degree. The more effort you spend in sort of organizing the elements in a way that's clear, that's ordered, that's logical, the more useful and usable your interface is going to be. The next principle of good user interface design is to economize. That means only including the elements that are critical to communication, the things that are immediately relevant to the task at hand. These are things that I need right now. They're things that I need in order to accomplish what I just started. The most important elements and actions on the screen should be easily perceived, and anything that's non-critical should be de-emphasized. And I'll show you a basic example of that. Let's assume we have a simple form that sits on a page that's in line on the screen where a user is asked to choose a specific item from a list of options and then execute the action. Click OK or cancel and go back and do something else. So let's take a look at the number of elements that the user essentially has to look at, absorb, in order to carry out that task. First, there's a title. Then we have a series of radio buttons and labels. But here's the thing. It's easy to assume that the radio button and its label are essentially one item, but the brain doesn't work that way. Here's actually what happens. The brain has to perceive each one of these things separately. And making that task even harder is the fact that items 5 and 6 sort of live in their own little world down at the bottom, centered instead of aligned with either of the other columns. Plus, we have two buttons crowded down into the bottom right corner, which essentially are the same size and carry the same visual weight. So they're essentially of equal importance to us at first glance. So how many items do we have to contend with on this very simple little form? Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Now, you may think to yourself, he's out of his mind. People don't consider all those things individually. Not consciously, but cognitively, absolutely. This is, again, basic physiology of the way we comprehend information dictates that we, in fact, have to process 15 elements in order to make a choice. In and of itself, that's not a huge deal. It maybe means an extra couple minutes staring at the form. But if you're working in a large, complex application, those instances add up. So a couple minutes per form, if you have 40 forms to complete, turns into a pretty significant chunk of time that you have to invest to complete this action. Fortunately for us, there's a better way to design this. Take a look at this example. You notice some things automatically right off the bat. Number one, the title is segregated from everything else in a gray bar. That clearly separates it from the functional elements that are happening below. It's not a choice, it's a descriptor. It's very clearly visually segregated and separated. Number two, our radio buttons and labels are now simply 6 boxes, 2 columns of 3. When I click one, the entire button highlights in gray, Contrast that to the radio button to the left, where the only indication that something is selected is a very tiny circle. This approach that we're taking on the right-hand side here is a much larger visual indicator that something has been selected, okay? It's much easier for us to get that, okay, yeah, that's the one I picked. Next, you'll notice that the primary action that we expect the user to take, which is to click the OK button to submit the form, is made more distinct, more obvious. It's larger, it's darker, and it's a button. The cancel option, on the other hand, is simply a text link. Why? It's a secondary action. We're de-emphasizing things that are non-critical or secondary, okay? Cancel is certainly an option, but it's not your primary option. It's not the core thing that you're there to do, all right? You didn't come to the page to cancel the form. You came to the page to fill out the form and click the big dark OK button. Now remember, we had 15 elements on the other form. How many do you think we have here? Well, let's take a look. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So we went from 15 to 9. Again, it may seem like an inconsequential thing. I assure you it is not. Every single element counts, and every single element adds to the cognitive load that the person has to deal with when they're trying to do something. Minimize it. Economize it. So this is just a quick example of how some very subtle, very simple visual design changes can economize things. Quite possibly the most important thing that visual design does is communicate. And that communication happens on a number of levels. To some degree, it's a balancing act, right? There's lots of elements on the screen, and each one of those elements plays a role in either enhancing understanding or creating confusion. So it's important that you do the former instead of the latter. And as I said, that's a balancing act, okay? Visual design has to balance legibility, readability, typography, symbolism, multiple views, color, texture. All those things are part of successful visual communication. The balance of all those things is what dictates whether someone reacts to what they see on the screen, whether they understand it and can act upon it. The simplest way to give you an example of this is with font use, okay? Because to a large degree, what we do on the screen is we read. We scan, we interpret, and we act based on that. So font use in particular is one of the most important decisions you'll ever make in an interface. And the thing is, it doesn't have to be complex, okay? You don't have to agonize over what fonts you're going to use and what style they are and what they look like. It's more a matter of making sure that they're easy to read. And before I get into the details of that, I want to sort of give you a basic premise that has everything to do with why we do or don't properly understand what we see, okay? And that's pattern recognition. Take a look at these letters. It's pretty obvious what that letter is, okay? You don't need me to tell you that that's a letter A. You automatically recognize it, even though each iteration of it that you're looking at is very different visually, okay? It's a different visual style. The reason you know automatically what that letter is because of pattern recognition. You've been exposed to it so many times. You've been exposed to that pattern of elements, two upward lines bisected by a horizontal line. You know what that letter is. So even if it varies stylistically, you recognize it. The brain automatically goes, seen that before, know what it is, not even a question, okay? That happens in milliseconds. When you're designing anything, it's very important to be aware of the role that pattern recognition plays in what you do, because when you get too decorative, when you sort of go crazy with a lot of elements and colors and decoration and you trying to be unique, sometimes that can interfere with pattern recognition. And, you know, in fine art, that's sort of not only acceptable, it's desirable. But in terms of interface design, where our end goal is to communicate with people, that approach is not a good one. Take a look at this first example. This is basic Arial default text. And as the quote says, okay, there are many fonts that are easy to read. Any one of them are fine to use, but you want to avoid a font that is so decorative that it starts to interfere with pattern recognition. So in this instance, this is really straightforward. We can automatically, very easily recognize those characters, and it's very easy to read. Now, let's pick a font that's slightly more decorative. Take a look at the difference. While we obviously still recognize the characters and we can still read this, it's slightly slower. It takes us just a tiny fraction of a bit longer to read because the font is a little more decorative and it's beginning to interfere with pattern recognition in a way. Now, let's go to an extreme example. Here's a font that's extraordinarily decorative. How long does it take you to read this? In this case, the pattern is very abstracted. It's less recognizable and therefore it's less readable. We have to expend more effort in order to interpret what we see. You'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't, but a lot of websites, a lot of software applications, a lot of systems that I see, people sort of get excited about the fact that they can play with all these fonts that they have on their machines, and you want to do something different because what the hell, your job can be a little boring from time to time, and I get that, but you have to be aware of the fact that when you make those choices, you are essentially making it more difficult for what's on the screen to be easily and quickly perceived and understood. When pattern recognition becomes abstracted, we have to work a lot harder to deal with what we see. So always, always, always err on the side of simple, legible, readable, clear, and recognizable. One of the most important things that I can possibly get across to you is this. Visual design is not decoration. They're very, very, very different. Decoration is purely visual. We look at something, we react to it. Wow, that's really cool. Or wow, that's really innovative or unique or interesting. I would have never thought of doing that way. Okay, that's decoration has visual impact. It's purely aesthetic in nature. But decoration does not communicate. It doesn't help anybody do anything. It doesn't explain. It doesn't clarify. It doesn't illuminate. It doesn't help us understand. Its job, really in a nutshell, is to sort of sit there and look pretty. Okay? And there's nothing wrong with that. But decoration doesn't have any place in visual design. I can't stress this enough. They're two different things. So design is not decoration. And that means that visual design should never be based on personal preference. I've designed hundreds of things in my career that I personally did not care for, okay, visually. It's not my sense of aesthetic. It's not something that's necessarily pleasing to my eye or my personal taste. Doesn't matter because it was appropriate and relevant to the audience. It did a good job of expressing the company's brand message, right? It was in line with what the organization wanted to express, and it was the kind of look and feel that the audience would appreciate. Because I'm designing for them, I'm not designing for me. By the same token, visual design should never be based on what looks cool. If you make a design decision and you do something visually on the screen, and someone says, well, why did you make that color? Or why did you choose that font? Or why did you use this image? Or why did you use this big red bar across the screen? Your answer should never, ever be, because it looks cool. Doesn't it look cool? Wrong, absolutely wrong, totally wrong. Okay, cool does not mean it communicates well. Cool does not mean anyone's going to be able to understand what you've done. Cool does not help anybody accomplish a task. It's just cool for the sake of being cool, and that's decoration. That's not design. So what am I trying to say? I'm saying forget about how things look. Ask yourself how your visual design choices work. And that means asking yourself these questions. Does the visual design support established objectives? Is what we're putting on the screen in line with what we said we were trying to accomplish strategically? Does the visual design clarify the options available? Does it help you understand what's available to you? Does visual design provide context and guidance? Okay, does it help you understand how things are related to other things? Does it give you a clue as to what actions you can take or what you're supposed to do next? Does visual design establish clear information and action priority? What should I do first? What should I do next? What happens after that, right? We want to be able to predict the outcomes of our actions, and the design of all the elements on the screen should enable us to do that. So make sure that your visual design is communicating instead of decorating.